Hello, fellow brothers and sisters. This is Sabata with the EQUATORIA Advocacy Foundation with a session on trying to clarify things here and there about the Declaration of Rights that was done on July 18th to the Equatorians. You see, those Declaration of Rights are basically the Human Rights Declaration of the 1947 that was basically put out by the United Nations. And those principles are not laws yet, but those principles are concepts that guide laws as laws get formed. So what am I saying? What I am saying is, fellow Equatorians, with those kind of principles, what you could do or how to benefit from those principles is your local legislatures of the state level, or what is called the lawmakers of the state level, could take those concepts and as they produce what is called legislature or laws, they should make sure that the provisions of the laws do not go out or do not step out of those concepts. So in other words, if then those provisions get interpreted, they fall within the meaning of those concepts. Let me be specific in an example. You see, and I'm going to give an example with what's called the Bill of Rights of the United States of America. You say when this Bill of Rights were amended, they were amended such that the interpretation of those laws, okay, do not overstep or do not go out of the concepts of freedom, liberty, and whatever rights it gave for property, which of course the United States of America took it for what is called the pursuit of happiness. I would like to give you an example of how this works. Yani, the point I'm trying to make to you, brothers and sisters, fellow Equatorians, is those principles that got declared act as a guide. Now, out of that, laws will eventually be produced through a process, and the process is called legislative process. And usually it is done in what is called the parliament or assembly by lawmakers. And then through a certain process also those provisions get signed into law. And then once those provisions get signed into law, then eventually it gets codified, it gets put into what is called codes, all right? And that is why when courts usually interpret those laws as they go through the process of what is called adjudication to decide on a particular matter, whether that matter is constitutional or not constitutional, or whether that matter violates a law, then they usually read those articles from what is called codes. You put those provisions in what is called codes. But let me not get into that. Let me just give you an example of how laws get formed and do not step out of the concepts of the principles of what is called human rights. Here is one example, and let me read from what is called Bill of Rights of the United States of America, which was ratified in December 15th, 1791. You know, when you look at that, this is the Bill of Rights, and I want you to see. I'm just gonna read one, all right, and if necessary, then also read two. Okay. Now, one says, it says, Congress shall not make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, Congress will not make any law that kind of respects religion. Let me just finish it all. Or abridging the freedom of speech of the press, or the right of the people peaceable to assemble and to petition government for a redress of grievances. So what does that mean? Now, when you look at this, you might think that it has no, this is a provision that ended up being codified into law. Now, and that is passed by what is called the legislatures through a legislative process, all right? And if you read this, you might think it has no connection with what is called liberty. But that is not true. It is actually falling within the concept of liberty. And what it simply means is, when it says Congress shall not make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that means if tomorrow, next tomorrow, Congress in the United States of America happen to try to pass a law that allows the Christianity religion to be taught at schools, for example, then the Supreme Court, if that law then gets to be taken to the Supreme Court, yes, the Supreme Court will eventually say, well, that law that is getting passed, or the law that is passed that allows Christianity religion to be taught in schools oversteps what is called Article 1. You see, and it oversteps Article 1, which says Congress shall not pass a law respecting an establishment of religion. And this is basically manifestation of what is called freedom, because it gives what is called freedom of worship. Because if Congress starts passing laws like that, then what eventually would happen is, if that will eventually mean Congress is now giving consideration to a particular religion than other religious faiths, like Islam, for example, and Buddhism, or whatever religious faiths that are being exercised here, would feel as though they are being neglected, all right? Or when we continue here, when you see Congress shall not do this thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. Of course, if Congress happens to pass a law that restricts you not to say certain things, then that will be basically infringement of what is called freedom of speech. That is also an infringement of what is called freedom speech or of the press. So you've never heard the government here trying to shut down press as the press try to put out the information out, like how we see last time how Makui was addressing the press in Juba. When we talk of in Juba, even some journalists are even killed, those of Isaiah Abraham, all right? Or the right of the people peaceful to assemble and to petition the government of a redress or grievances. The bottom line is, what I'm trying to communicate here is that the provisions of laws that will be provided by your leaders or by your legislative parliamentarians or assembly people will eventually be governed. You know, when they produce their laws, their laws will be governed by those concepts. So those concepts will act as guide so that the laws will not overstep those concepts. But those concepts, those principles by themselves are not laws. So the laws then eventually gets made through your parliament or assembly, and then through a certain process gets signed by your governors, and then eventually will become laws, and then it will be codified so that the courts will eventually interpret it. No courts in this world will try to interpret those principles directly as they are declared by the UN, by the Declaration of United Nations in 1947. That is not possible. Another example I will give you is Article 2. It says, well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yeah, that is Article 2, freedom to bear arms. That's why when some democratic politicians here talk about regulating the purchase of arms, some other people will jump up and say, hey, you know what, that is an infringement to our Second Amendment. You see, they talk of, politicians like to twist things, even though a politician might say, hey, let's regulate. Another one will say, hey, you know what, they are trying to take your guns, your guns out. This is a violation of Second Amendment. I will not get into those kind of politics. But the point I'm trying to make here is that those, and when you look at this is actually freedom, giving you the freedom to bear arms. So the point I'm trying to make here is, out of those principles, there are laws that gets made, and the laws should be designed such that it does not overstep or it does not go out of those principles. It should not go contrary to those principles. Like, for example, as I have said earlier, now suppose a country says we are going to make it a constitutional law, nobody is going to own arms or nobody is going to do this. Well, a country can do that if they feel that the arms is bringing a lot of havoc. But to a certain degree, if those restrictions are getting many, then it will be declared that that country is basically restricting people so much, and there is no much freedom or there is no much liberty in those kind of countries. Like most of the Middle East countries, of course, their constitutions are basically Islamically based, and it has so many restrictions, especially in what is called moral codes on how people are supposed to live and all these kind of things. So the point I'm trying to make here is that those principles that were declared are not laws by themselves. All right, those principles are not laws. Those principles are simply principles that guide laws as laws are actually produced. And in fact, an example can be taken is, it is through those principles that United States of America has produced what is called Bill of Rights. All right, as they sat down through a legislative process with their lawmakers, they sat down and their lawmakers were able to produce those provisions. And if you read through those provisions, you might need somebody who has studied constitutional law, somebody who has studied political science with emphasis to law and took constitutional law as courses to explain exactly which provisions are manifestation of liberties, which provisions are manifestation of justice, or which laws are designed and are not overstepping what is called the rights to own this. Recently we've had, and I think that was the last law that Supreme Court has decided on in the United States of America about what's called the individual mandate, when the Affordable Health Care Act was passed by the former President Barack Obama. The law has a provision in it called the individual mandate. It mandates each and every individual within the United States of America to have insurance. And if you don't have insurance, you get penalized. That's why if you don't have insurance, you have worked, you don't have insurance as you're filing your tax return and you have not proven that you have insurance, there are penalties, all right? And that is through the individual mandate provision. And that provision was actually taken to court because there are politicians who are pushed by, there are politicians who have actually brought a case, and the case was basically lining out that individual mandate is overstepping what is called freedom of Americans to whether they is overstepping freedom of choice of the United States citizen whether they want to own insurance or not. And the Supreme Court happened to struck that down and said, you know what, yes, it is within the power of the federal to basically decide whether it is correct to penalize you if you don't have insurance. That's why the individual mandate was not basically thrown out by the Supreme Court. So that is that. So the bottom line, what I'm trying to communicate to you, and I apologize if this message is very abstract because I know it has a lot of things here and there that are kind of that needs you to understand certain things here and there about the legal aspects of how laws are produced of principles, you know, and how to interpret them into making sure that you know what, it is not exceeding or overstepping the principle. But the bottom line, what I'm trying to communicate to you, fellow brothers and sisters, is those principles that were declared July 18th, 2020, are guide. And when you look at those principles are good. Those principles will help you live better. But it cannot just help you live better without those principles be used as guide to generate the laws of the country, the laws of your state, all right? So that, because human nature is unpredictable. You can imagine so many people. There are people who are insane. There are people who don't understand. There are people. How do you govern all these people to behave in a certain way so that those who are not complying with specific conduct or moral conducts will eventually be taken to court to be penalized? It is through those kind of laws, you know, and as those laws are produced within your states, all right, these principles will act as a guide, so that eventually, if there are laws that are produced that basically overstep or go beyond what is called giving you liberty, giving you freedom, or giving you the right to be in your ancestral lands, then it can easily be declared through our courts that, hey, those laws are not consistent, those provisions are not consistent with our principles, all right? You need principles, and then you develop laws within the principles, all right? Laws don't just come out of nowhere. Laws come from within principles. We live by principles, all right? We live by principles, and as we generate laws, the laws fall within principles. If we are producing a law that prohibits murdering of people, killing people, of course, it is because by principle, killing is bad, all right? Killing is bad. It's even in the Bible, it says killing is bad, right? It is a principle. And out of that principle, laws eventually gets produced that prohibits people from doing such kind of an act. Or if you do such kind of an act, then it will be classified as homicide or murder or something else like that, and put into classes, first degree, second degree, whatever it is now. It takes a heck of a job to do all those kind of things. But the bottom line is, those are principles. Those principles will be guide to laws as laws gets formed. Now, under the normal circumstances, those principles, under the normal circumstances, when South Sudan became independent and became a member of the United Nations, under the normal circumstances, it is South Sudan to look at such provisions, to look at such principles, and have what is called the parliamentarians to sit down and draft laws, provisions that do not overstep or do not go out of those concepts, and eventually have those provisions be codified into laws. Basically, well, eventually they will have to be signed into law, and then after they get signed into law, then lawyers will come and now put them in codes. All right, they will be put in codes, and there are ways of now breaking some of those codes, some of those provisions. There are some annotations that gets broken down into pieces before they even now gets to be put in what is called books, the law books that eventually end up in law libraries and end up in that now courts use in order to interpret, to decide on matters. You see what I'm saying? So under the normal circumstances, it's supposed to be the country, South Sudan, that is supposed to do all this process, what the process I've just explained. That is, the country, of course, has what is called parliamentarians. Under the normal circumstances, it's supposed to be South Sudan as a country to take those provisions and then look at those provisions, and then as their parliamentarians produce laws, then the laws will always be guided by those principles. All right, and of course, these principles don't guide all the laws that you produce in your country. No, there are certain laws that you will produce in your country that are pretty much governed by the principles that you have in your country. Like for example, let me say the age to marriage. All right, in your country, you know, those different tribes have different ages. Now, if your country, if South Sudan chooses by principle of looking at all those cultural traditions and how we believe in the age of marriage, and choose that, okay, South Sudan is going to have the legal age of marriage to be, for example, 17, if they chose it that, then that provision is pretty much produced through a principle that is other than the human rights principle, but principles that the people of South Sudanese live by. All right? Because most of the South Sudanese pretty much, I think, get their children married even 15 or even 16. I'm afraid even others even marry their children out at 14 years, you see. But if the country now chooses to say, okay, we, the legislature in South Sudan, decide that our legal age of marriage is going to be 17, this is now based on the principle not of the human rights, but of the local norms that we live by. You see, and then the legislatures there, because they are people of there, of course, they'll just say, let us agree on this particular age. For some reasons, of course, they will say, well, age 17 seems to be reasonable. The girl at this point could have finished maybe at least university, you know. It will be determined, you know. But the bottom line is, the point I'm trying to make to you is, under the normal circumstances, South Sudan as a country should be the one to actually take those principles, and then out of which they will be producing laws that will eventually be codified and then put into law books, so that courts will do their work if the local population are not living or are infringing those laws. In this way, those laws will manage, will regulate behaviors of people, so that with time, people will be behaving in a certain way. And that's how a country is supposed to manage lives of their people. But given our country, the way we see our country, South Sudan, how it is, fellow Equatorians, trust me and take this from me, you don't expect South Sudan to get to this point. And you cannot wait for South Sudan to, you can't wait, you can't have that trust. You can't have that trust that once upon a time, there will come time when there will be some leaders that, of course, there will be a government that I doubt if it's going to be not predominantly Dinka or from Nuer, who will eventually have or bring a country that eventually will have a constitution that will have laws or provisions of laws that are guided through these principles that we have been talking about. Those good principles of freedom, of liberty, justice, equality. Right now, as we are living, yes, it is expected that the laws is supposed to hold everybody equal. Look at South Sudan. Look at those people who are said to be the elites who have fought this movement. They treat people like animals in South Sudan. So there is no equality there. There is no justice. You see, if you if a car of a general hit you, even if the general is at fault, first of all, there are no laws to determine that the general is at fault to begin with, and definitely the bodyguards of the general will beat you to death, and if you don't die, you're lucky. That's the condition of life we are living in. So I don't think you Equatorians, you cannot wait to have a country once upon a time that will have, in this country, South Sudan. Trust me, take this from me, you will never have time when the country will have leaders who will make sure they build laws or provisions of laws guided by those principles. They will not. And I hope it's now clear. I hope I've explained to you how those principles are now used, okay? Those principles are simply used as guide, but they are not laws by themselves, but through a certain process, the laws eventually gets crafted or drafted right here in your within your state with your lawmakers, and then signed into law, and then codified, okay, codified into books, and then taken to law library to be interpreted when you get charged. Because when you get charged of a crime, because the way the laws are put usually are so complicated that it's just not easy for a policeman to say Felan Galtan, Felan Amal Kida. No, it gets to be taken to the court so that the court interpret those laws, and after interpretation of those laws and based on your circumstances, then it will be decided by the court whether you're really guilty or not. You see, so I hope I've made it very clear that those principles are not the laws, but eventually through a certain process, and your legislative members will sit down and then produce the laws, and then these laws will eventually be codified, and then they will go to law books, and then eventually the courts use them to interpret the laws. I hope I've made this very clear, and for that reason, fellow Equatorians, those principles that were declared to you July 18th, those are simple principles through which, when your laws eventually gets produced, the laws will eventually be falling within those principles, so that you will be enjoying freedom. Otherwise, if those principles are not used as guides to produce your laws, there will be laws that will be so crazy that will deprive you from those freedom, from those liberty, okay? Would deprive you from your ancestral lands, all right? And that will be it. So basically, fellow brothers and sisters, this process here is something that should have actually been done from the time we have obtained this country back in 2011. But look at where we are at today. The country is just going nowhere. Let the country go. Take those. Right now, yes, you do not have powers to install these principles, but we are crossing our fingers that once upon a time we will get a federal system, and eventually have these principles guide our laws within our states. We have the central, the eastern, the western, Equatoria. So far, we recommend that if they produce laws within their states, those laws will be governed under those principles, so that the people then enjoy those freedom. It is true that right now we are having a centralized system, and basically an anarchy the central authority may not give chance to the people of Equatoria to implement that. But I am sure that this is not going to continue. We will eventually get that federalism going. If we don't get that federalism, I'm sure there will come a time when we will come to realize that maybe we should go as far as confederacy. And if confederacy is also hard, and when we are getting to this confederacy, it's not going to be easy. It might end up getting bloody, and when it gets bloody, heaven knows how the situation is going to end up in. But what is important is to ideologically hold to those ideas, and to know that those are your rights, and to know that those are the principles that will govern laws as laws gets produced within your states, and as those laws gets passed within your states, and as those laws gets codified within your states, and as your state courts interpret those laws to determine whether there is guilt or not. All right. Thank you very much. This is very important, fellow Equatorians. Please uphold to this idea. Make sure you groom yourself in this idea. Make sure our younger ones groom themselves in this idea, because if South Sudan continues the way it's going right now, it is very necessary that those kind of ideas will drive us to basically respond in a way that we will eventually end up living and enjoying those kind of freedom. Thank you very much. God bless you.